Let's talk about death, baby. Let's talk about you and Flea. Let's talk about the Black Death. So, what was the Black Death? I'm so glad you asked. The Black Death was a global pandemic of the bubonic plague, and it was the most fatal pandemic in human history. It killed 40 to 60% of the people it affected, equaling out to about 25 to 50 million people. This plague occurred over the years 1346 to 1353. The bubonic plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis that was spread by infected fleas. If you were to contract the Black Death, you could expect to live about 5 days before dying. The Black Death came in 3 types. The bubonic, which was caught from the bite of an infected flea. The second type was septicemic, caught from the bites of infected fleas or handling an infected animal. It could develop from an untreated bubonic type. Lastly, the third type was pneumonic. It was the most serious form of the Black Death, and it was the only one that could spread person to person by infectious droplets. What were some of the symptoms you could expect from the Black Death? Well, I'll provide you a little list. Fever, headache, chills, extreme weakness, buboes, abdominal pain, shock, bleeding, skin and tissues turning black and dying, fingers, toes, and nose were the most common, pneumonia, chest pain, cough, bloody mucus, and death. Now, rightfully so, people had some pretty bizarre beliefs and practices during the Black Death. This was a pretty apocalyptic moment in history. I mean, think, 40 to 60% of the population died from this. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the weird practices and activities that occurred during the Black Death. Something you may not have expected the Black Death to have something to do with is warfare, as the Black Death actually served as a form of biological warfare. In the 1346 siege of Kaffa, the attacking Tartar army was being devastated by the disease. They had no hope of escaping and completely lost interest in the siege due to the high death rates their army was facing due to the disease. Despite this, they ordered that the bodies of the dead would be catapulted into the city that they were sieging. They expected the stench to kill everyone on the other side. When the bodies arrived after being catapulted, the Christians couldn't escape the sheer amount of them and tried their best to dump as many as possible into the sea. This clearly was unsuccessful as the bodies just kept piling up and began rotting and infecting the water supplies as well as living conditions. Ultimately, the disease began to infect those on the other side, and therefore, the bodies of the dead were used as biological warfare against those who, frankly, didn't have it yet. The next bizarre practice from the Black Death ties into the last one mentioned. Remember the stench? Well, there was something called the miasma theory. The miasma theory was the belief that bad air or bad smells were the cause of the spread, and that you could ingest it by breathing it in or sucking it in through your sweaty skin. Many people tried preventative measures to avoid this miasma theory, including avoiding being in the same air as a plague victim, and the wealthy would move to the countryside to get to pure air. Priests would flee from their parishes and refuse to give funerals because they thought the bodies gave off miasma. People stopped taking hot baths and stopped exercising to avoid getting sweaty at all, and people carried bunches of flowers and herbs to purify the air. I mean, who doesn't carry around their pocket full of dried flowers to purify the air around them? I know I do. The next strange practice during the Black Death was done by the Flagellants, a group of religious zealots who sought atonement for their sins by publicly whipping themselves in displays of penance. People during the plague didn't really know what was causing it at times and thought that it may have been a sign of divine punishment. Some thought that maybe seeking punishment for their sins could speed up the repercussions of the Black Death, and thus the Flagellants came in, and despite being condemned by the church, they gained a lot of followers during the Black Death, These groups became so popular that some reached numbers over 1,000 followers. Flagellants would act in some sort of beating ritual, where they would beat themselves with leather straps studded with sharp metal pieces. These beating rituals would go on for 33.5 days as they would repeat the ritual 3 times daily. Then, they would move on to the next town and continue the ritual all over again. A quote from Sir Robert of Avebury, who witnessed the flagellants ritual in 1349. Quote, "In that same year of 1349, about Michaelmas, September 29th, over 600 men came to London from Flanders, mostly of Zealand and Holland origin. Sometimes at St. Paul's and sometimes at other points in the city, they made 2 daily public appearances, wearing cloths from thighs to the ankles, but otherwise stripped bare. Each wore a cap marked with a red cross in front and behind. Each had in his right hand a scourge with 3 tails. Each tail had a knot, and through the middle of it were sometimes sharp nails fixed. They marched naked in a file, one behind the other, and whipped themselves with these scourges on their naked and bleeding bodies. 4 of them would chant in their native tongue, and another 4 would chant in response like a litany. Thrice they would all cast themselves on the ground in this sort of procession, stretching out their hands like the arms of a cross. The singing would go on, and the one who was in the rear of those thus prostrate, acting first, each of them in turn would step over the others and give 1 stroke with his scourge to the man lying under him. This went on from the first to the last until each of them had observed the ritual to the full tale of those on the ground. Then each put on his customary garments, and always wearing their caps and carrying their whips in their hands, they retired to their lodgings. It is said that every night they performed the same penance." End quote. The final bizarre practice of the Black Death I will be discussing today is that of the plague pits.
Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!
Plague pits referred to the mass burial sites where victims were buried during the Black Death. With the streets, cemeteries, and graveyards filling up, they needed somewhere to put the mass of bodies. I mean, people were dropping like flies. Or should I say fleas? Too soon. Pits would be filled with as many bodies that could possibly fit until there was a 6-foot clearance between the bodies and the surface. Then they would be covered up. Plague pits were not just a thing of urban areas, as in 2013, a plague pit containing 48 bodies was uncovered in Lincolnshire, showing that rural areas also were victims of this plague. The 48 victims were tested, and some contained the bacteria for the Black Death, thus proving that they were victims of the Black Death. The Black Death was a very scary and strange time for the people who lived in it, and it's no wonder that these people came up with such bizarre practices, beliefs, and rituals to deal with the shock that their region was facing. Black Death is such a fascinating period in human history and truly shows the resilience of humanity through an honestly apocalyptic time in history.